Hello, my name is Kyndle Kirby, and I'm an educator in the state of Alaska and a graduate student at Western Governors University. As a part of my Capstone research project through WGU, I am presenting on my own research conducted in my classroom, titled The Impact of Art Integration on Student Knowledge Retention. The topic of this study, as I just stated, is the impact of art integration on student knowledge retention. And as an educator who has worked in public, private, homeschool, and charter school settings, I have found art integration to be a helpful learning strategy. I, unfortunately, am often continually disappointed to see how within the United States the integration of art into core subjects is largely undervalued, underutilized, and understudied, despite a growing body of evidence suggesting its significant impact on academic achievement and the holistic development of students. However, this evidence is not fully explored or applied within mainstream education, and this gap in research and practice deprives many students of a beneficial instructional model. This research is designed to investigate the impact of arts integration, specifically in my 6th grade classroom, and to answer the research question of how does art integration through drawing impact students' reading comprehension? It is my hope that this research will be a small contribution to the growing body of research on art integration, and that it will support and encourage educators in implementing evidence-based best practices in their classrooms. I specifically chose art integration for mainly 2 reasons. The first being, I recently began working in a very unique school environment in which all our students learn through various forms of art mediums. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that my new students are the most curious, knowledgeable, self-motivated, hardworking, creative, and well-rounded students I have ever worked with. There are many factors that may contribute to this, but I am curious to know how much of a role art has to play. And the second reason being, as I began my master's program, I ran across some research that claimed students who draw what they learn about retain 50% more information than those who do not draw, even if they are poor artists. These 2 factors motivated me to pursue this study. Originally, I planned to conduct a longitudinal comparative study to examine how much more effective art is as a learning tool compared to other methods. However, my professor suggested I simplify the study to meet the research requirements for my master's program. The scope of my initial plan was far too broad and would be better suited for a future doctoral dissertation. So I finally settled on an action research study in which I implemented an instructional intervention by integrating art into our classroom activities. And then I calculated how much my students remembered about what they read after drawing the concepts about which they were learning. This was a simple study, to say the least. It's intended to help fill the research gap that exists in regards to art as a learning strategy, and is only a small contribution to the growing body of research. It's a dipstick test, if you will, with which to compare to other studies. It is my hope that this simple study might be of some assistance to educators in helping them understand the impact of art integration as a learning strategy and how to implement it well. There were 4 main elements to my methodology, the first being the literature review and design of the research project, the second being acquiring the proper legal and ethical forms to conduct the study, such as informed consent forms and site permission. The third being the implementation process of my study, which included a pre-assessment, art integration activities, and the post-assessment. And the fourth final component being the data analysis of the assessment scores that were collected before and after the intervention through the pre and post assessments. The first step in my research methodology was the literature review of recent and relevant peer-reviewed studies on art integration research experiments. It was this literature review that I conducted that guided my own research. As mentioned earlier, there is a growing body of research on the topic of art integration, but unfortunately there is still a significant research gap in the studies conducted on K through 12 students in the general classroom. I found no recent or relevant studies specifically analyzing the impact of drawing in core subjects in a middle school classroom. I found several studies conducted on college students, nursing students, and ESL students. The few research articles I found that studied K-12 students involved various art activities such as creative drama and music, but did not specifically analyze the impact of drawing. The most relevant study was that of the English language learners who were given art assignments prior to a writing assignment, and it was suggested that drawing would help the students visually explore, depict, and understand the concepts about which they would later write. The researchers found a significant positive impact on the writing scores of the students who drew the topic before they wrote about it. So despite the research gap, the general consensus gleaned from this scientific literature that I reviewed was that the creative arts, whether drawing, painting, crafting 3D models, playing an instrument, free writing, or role playing, they all had a positive and significant impact on students' comprehension, knowledge retention, engagement, motivation, academic achievement, and even cognitive development. So there is no longer a question about whether art integration has an impact on learning or not. It certainly does. Now, the question at hand is, how does art integration impact learning? And beyond that, which art activities have the greatest positive impact and why? In an attempt to begin to answer these questions, I designed this simple experiment in which I first crafted a pre-assessment. This was administered to my students to test for their baseline understanding of business math before we began learning the content. Next, I planned art integration activities for my students to take part in after reading stories and informational articles. The goal being that they would draw what they were learning about and thus further explore, conceptualize, solidify, and demonstrate their understanding of the business math concepts that we were reading about. Then I crafted the post-assessment, which contained the exact same questions as the pre-assessment. This post-assessment was delivered after the art activities were completed to determine how much students remembered about what they read with the help of the art integration activities. And finally, I planned to collect and analyze the data from the pre-assessment and post-assessment to calculate and quantify the impact of art integration in my classroom. The second step was to gain consent and permission. Before conducting any part of my study or collecting any data, I first gained my CITI certification so that I could legally study my students. I also sent each of my students' families an informed consent form requesting the parents' and students' permission to collect and analyze the student data. And then I received permission from my principal to conduct this research on site to ensure my study was conducted legally and ethically. Once I could legally and ethically proceed with my study, I began by administering the pre-assessment. It was delivered as a Google Form quiz and included 40 questions about self-sufficiency, bartering, the development of currency, as well as how banks work, how to calculate interest, how to design a business plan, just to name a few. This pre-assessment was administered before we had begun our business math block, and I was pleasantly surprised with how much my students already knew about business math. Each day, we as a class spent an hour and a half of instructional time for 2 weeks, reading stories and informational articles while the students demonstrated their understanding of what we read about through their drawings. For example, when learning about different types of economic activity and the development of currency, the students were asked to draw their own depiction of hunter-gatherers making their own goods, bartering for additional goods that they couldn't make, and purchasing items with one of the first forms of currency. Another example is when learning about interest, students were asked to draw a conversion wheel in which they learned and demonstrated how to convert between decimals, percentages, and fractions. At the end of our art activities, the post-assessment was administered via Google Forms and contained the exact same 40 questions that were in the pre-assessment. Not all of my students participated in the study, so I only collected and analyzed data for 20 of my 24 students. I collected their assessment data from Google Forms and analyzed it simply by finding the class average, median, and range for the pre-assessment and the post-assessment. I then subtracted both averages to find the percentage of increased reading comprehension and knowledge retention. Additionally, I calculated the standard deviation to determine the significance of my data. As can be seen in these visuals, the score distribution of the pre-assessment scores featured at the top are lower and spread farther apart than those of the post-assessment at the bottom. The post-assessment scores at the bottom are noticeably higher than the scores of the pre-assessment. The pre-assessment class average was 24 out of 40 points. The median was 24 out of 40 points, and the range was 12 to 35 points. For the post-assessment, the class average was 31.8 out of 40 points. The median was 33 out of 40 points, and the range was 21 to 38 points. This indicates that the class average improved by 7.8 points and through art integration in the classroom. And this was an overall 19.5% increase in the class's average knowledge retention. The standard deviation of the pre-assessment was 5.93, while the standard deviation of the post-assessment was 4.18. This decrease in variability by 1.75 indicates that the scores were more spread out before the intervention and were distributed more closely after the intervention. This also indicates that the students' scores became more consistent and clustered more closely around the class average. In sum, all of my students performed better on the post-assessment than on the pre-assessment. The class as a whole increased their knowledge on the topic of business math by an average of approximately 20%, and the standard deviation decreased significantly. This suggests that more students improved and performed similarly well after the intervention. The class experienced overall improvement and more consistent performance through this activity. It's obvious that these art integration activities had an overall significant and positive impact upon this class in regard to their knowledge retention. This study provides quantitative data that can be compared to other studies and function as a springboard of sorts to help determine the impact of art integration, specifically drawing, on learning and how much of an impact it has in comparison with other art activities or other learning strategies. 3 of the strengths of this study are its clear structure, measurable outcomes, and the use of the identical pre-assessment and post-assessment, which ensured consistency and the ability to directly compare the assessments to determine students' knowledge retention and academic achievement via the art integration activities. However, there are some noticeable weaknesses. The first being small sample size, second being the limited statistical data analysis, and the third being the subjective nature of the creative tasks. The sample size was small, like I said before, only 20 students, and because only one classroom was tested, this reduced the generalizability of the evidence and findings. The statistics provided insights, but more thorough statistical testing could add more significance and depth to the results. Engagement and comprehension demonstrated through creative activities is also difficult to quantify, which adds a whole nother layer of complication and complexity. There are several factors that may have had an impact on the results of this study. The first being the unique charter school that I work at that follows the Waldorf education model. Many of the students are familiar with using art in the classroom, and this may have affected their level of engagement, positively or negatively. For students who regularly take part in creative projects, the excitement of doing something new in class may have been lacking, and thus the engagement diminished. On the other hand, the students' prior experience with art activities may have helped them engage more fully with the learning activities. The second factor is the classroom environment. This includes the student-teacher rapport, which most likely had an impact on how receptive or how unreceptive students were to the activities. And the clarity of my instructions as the teacher could also have had an impact on the students' performance. The third and final factor is the presence of reference materials. Chromebooks, for example, were used for researching and viewing art references, which may have either enhanced or diminished the students' quality of work and their personal abilities to more clearly visualize difficult and abstract concepts. Future research could benefit by expanding the scope of this investigation. As mentioned earlier, this was a simple and small study, a dipstick test, a springboard, just scratching the surface of a learning tool with great potential. Some suggestions for future research are to use larger sample sizes, conduct longitudinal studies, comparative studies, to include qualitative measures, and employ multimodal assessments. Using a larger sample size could mean that studies would be conducted across a variety of classrooms and schools with varying levels of diversity and would lead to an increase in generalizability of the findings. In regards to longitudinal studies, research conducted over a long time span to determine how art integration impacts knowledge retention and academic achievement over weeks, months, and years could be incredibly helpful. In comparative studies, comparing traditional teaching methods against art integration methods could also be helpful in determining the significance of the impact. Including qualitative measures such as students' personal reflections on the activities could provide deeper and more thorough insights into the engagement, motivation, and understanding of students. And using multimodal assessments could be conducted on how art impacts specific disciplines or subjects. Additional studies could be conducted to determine which art activities have the greatest or the least impact on students' academic achievement. In sum, further investigation upon this topic has the potential to revolutionize educational models and assist educators in their search for how to most effectively implement evidence-based best practices to create a more helpful, hopeful, and humane education system. Here, I have included all references contained in my capstone research project that informed the design of this study, if anyone is interested in perusing them. Additionally, if you'd like to read my capstone research project paper for yourself in its entirety, 46 pages to be exact, it can be found at the web address linked here. And most importantly, I would like to thank Western Governors University staff and faculty who aided me in this educational journey. I'd especially like to thank my program mentor, Alda Garrett, who was with me every step of the way, and my capstone professor and mentor, Dr. Tyler Harper Gamp, who provided prompt responses, invaluable guidance, and essential insights.